Caroline Callahan sat alone in her cramped apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, as if the entire world was suffocating her. She couldn't believe it. The will had been read, and her parents had left her nothing. Not a single cent. Meanwhile, her sister, the golden child, Abigail, received everything. The house, the savings, the family business, all handed over on a silver platter, as if Caroline didn't even exist. Abigail had always been the perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong. She was their pride and joy, the successful lawyer married to a wealthy real estate mogul. Caroline, on the other hand, was the black sheep, a failed artist who couldn't hold down a steady job according to her parents. But the betrayal cut deeper than just financial loss. Caroline had spent years caring for their aging parents. She had put her life on hold to tend to their every need, while Abigail was too busy climbing the corporate ladder. Now, Abigail was gloating, smug and self-satisfied, as if she had won some twisted competition. Caroline's mind replayed the scene from the reading of the will. Abigail, standing there in her perfectly tailored dress, pretending to be surprised by the inheritance. The way she placed a soft, pitying hand on Caroline's shoulder, whispering, "I'm sure they just forgot to mention you. You know how forgetful Mom and Dad could be." But Caroline knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move. And Abigail was hiding something. Caroline could feel it in her gut. That night, as Caroline lay awake in her tiny bed, staring at the ceiling, the memories of her parents' final months haunted her. There were whispers, secret conversations between Abigail and their father behind closed doors. The sudden change in the will just weeks before their parents' death. Abigail's insistence on handling all the legal matters. Something was very wrong. Caroline's hands trembled as she gripped the worn edges of her parents' old dining table, now the only significant piece of furniture she owned. The apartment felt colder, emptier, as if the betrayal itself had stolen what little warmth remained. She stared at the faded family photograph resting against the wall. Her parents' smiles now seemed cruel, hollow. Abigail stood at the center, arms around both parents, as if claiming them as her own. Caroline was pushed to the side, almost out of the frame. Outside, the rain beat against the window, a relentless, rhythmic pounding that echoed Caroline's heartbeat. The envelope sat in front of her, the final notice on her overdue rent. 2 more weeks, and she'd be out on the street. Meanwhile, Abigail was likely lounging in the estate's sunroom, sipping imported wine, pretending she'd earned every penny she stole. The thought gnawed at Caroline, festering like an open wound. How had Abigail convinced their parents to rewrite the will? Their father, Leonard, had always been stern, yes, but he was fair. He would never have cut Caroline off completely, not after everything she did for them. Unless Abigail had found a way to twist his mind, to poison him against her. But how? A sudden memory flashed before Caroline's eyes. Just 2 months before their father died, Caroline had overheard a conversation between Abigail and their father. It was late. She was bringing him his medication when she heard them arguing in hushed tones behind the closed door of his study. "I'm just saying, Dad." Abigail's voice was firm, controlled. "You need to think about what's best for the family, for the business. Caroline, she's just not capable. You know that." There was a pause. Then Leonard's voice, weak and tired, murmured something Caroline couldn't make out. But she remembered the way Abigail emerged from the room minutes later, her face set in grim determination. Now, with the will read and Abigail in control, that conversation took on a darker meaning. Abigail hadn't just manipulated the will, she had systematically dismantled Caroline's relationship with their parents, painting her as irresponsible, incapable, a burden. Caroline's jaw clenched. She could almost feel the walls closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of injustice. The question now wasn't just how Abigail had convinced their father, it was what else she was hiding. Because if Abigail had gone this far, there was no telling how deep her schemes truly went. Caroline sat at the corner booth of Tom's Diner, the only place in town where she could still afford a cup of coffee. The worn-out vinyl seat creaked as she leaned back, eyes fixed on the street outside. The world kept moving, indifferent to her unraveling life. "Caroline?" She turned to see Patty O'Connor, a former nurse who had cared for her father in the last few months of his life. Patty was a stout woman with tired eyes and a kind smile. "Oh, hi, Patty," Caroline said, forcing a smile. Patty slid into the booth without asking, her eyes full of concern. "I heard about the will. I'm so sorry, Caroline. It doesn't seem right." Caroline swallowed, her throat tight. "It doesn't feel right either. You were around a lot those last few months. Did you ever hear Abigail and Dad talking? Anything that seemed off?" Patty hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There was one night. Your father had a bad spell, and Abigail stayed late. I heard them arguing. Your dad was saying something about not wanting to change the will. He sounded upset." Caroline's heart pounded. "And Abigail?" Patty's jaw tensed. She kept telling him it was for the best, that he needed to think about the future of the family business, that you wouldn't know how to handle it. Your dad was tired, confused. He kept saying, "But Caroline..." And Abigail just kept pressing him. She wouldn't let it go. A chill ran down Caroline's spine. "Did you hear anything else?" Patty shook her head, looking down at her coffee cup. "No, but the next day, Abigail came to me and told me not to mention any family matters to you, said it would only upset you." Caroline clenched her fists under the table. Abigail was more manipulative than she had imagined, but it wasn't just the will. There was something deeper, a reason why Abigail wanted everything under her control. "Thank you, Patty," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Patty reached across the table and squeezed Caroline's hand. "Be careful, Caroline. Abigail's not who she used to be." Caroline nodded, her jaw set. It was time to start digging. If Abigail thought she could erase her, she was sorely mistaken. Caroline's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her car parked just outside Abigail's sprawling estate. The house loomed over her, its perfectly manicured lawns and grand columns standing in sharp contrast to Caroline's threadbare apartment. She hadn't called ahead. Abigail would have found an excuse to avoid her. Instead, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and marched up the stone path to the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing Abigail, dressed impeccably in a tailored cream blouse and dark slacks. "Caroline," Abigail said, her smile cold and calculated. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I bet," Caroline muttered, pushing past her into the house. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and something else, whiskey, faint but distinct. Abigail closed the door, her jaw tightening. "What do you want?" Caroline spun around, meeting her sister's icy gaze. "I want to know why Dad changed the will, why he cut me out." Abigail's expression didn't flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms, leaning casually against the wall. "Dad made his own decisions. Maybe you should have tried harder to impress him." Caroline felt a surge of anger rise up her throat. "I was the one taking care of him, Abigail. I was the one cleaning up after him, making his meals, getting him to his doctor's appointments while you were off in your penthouse, playing the perfect daughter." Abigail's lips twitched, a shadow of a smirk crossing her face. "And maybe he noticed how little you accomplished, Caroline. Maybe he decided to give everything to someone who wouldn't waste it." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "I spoke to Patty." That got a reaction. Abigail's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with something dark and dangerous. "Patty?" "Yes," Caroline said, her voice steady. "She told me how you pressured Dad to change the will, how you wouldn't let up, kept telling him I was incapable of handling anything." Abigail stepped forward, her face mere inches from Caroline's. "You're grasping at straws, Caroline. Patty was always too nosy for her own good. And you? You're nothing but a bitter, washed-up artist who can't accept that Dad made the right choice." Caroline swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm not giving up, Abigail. I know there's more to this, and I will find it." Abigail's gaze hardened. "Be careful, Caroline. Dig too deep, and you might find things you're better off not knowing." Caroline held her sister's stare for a beat longer before turning on her heel and walking out. The air outside was cooler, crisper, but it did little to soothe the anger churning inside her. Abigail's reaction confirmed it. There was something more, something Abigail was hiding, and Caroline was determined to find it. The eviction notice now sat open on Caroline's tiny kitchen table, the bold letters demanding payment within 5 days. The clock was ticking, and Caroline had nowhere to go. Abigail had made sure of that. With every passing hour, the walls of her apartment seemed to close in tighter, pressing against her like a vice. But she couldn't afford to crumble. Not yet. Not when she was so close to the truth. Caroline rummaged through the box of her father's old belongings that she'd managed to salvage before Abigail took over the estate. Among the yellowed papers and worn books, she found a small, unmarked notebook. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, neat and methodical, each letter perfectly formed. Flipping through the pages, she found mostly mundane notes, grocery lists, phone numbers, reminders. But then, one entry caught her eye. Meeting with Abigail. Insists Caroline can't handle finances. Wants control of assets. Feeling pressured. Not sure if it's the right thing. Caroline's heart raced. Her father had doubts. He'd been second-guessing the decision to change the will. But why hadn't he said anything to her? And how had Abigail convinced him to go through with it despite his reservations? Desperation pushed Caroline to think of anyone who might have been close to her father in those final weeks. There was Jerry Mathis, the old handyman who had worked on the estate for years. Jerry was fiercely loyal to their father, and if anyone had seen or heard anything, it would be him. Caroline found Jerry at the rundown bar on the outskirts of town, nursing a beer. His once strong frame was slouched, shoulders hunched over the counter. His eyes were bloodshot, heavy with something unsaid. "Jerry," Caroline said, sliding onto the stool next to him, "I need to talk to you. It's about my dad." Jerry didn't look at her. He just took another swig of his beer. "Should have known you'd come around," he muttered, voice thick. "I told Leonard not to trust her." Caroline's pulse quickened. "Abigail?" Jerry nodded, setting his beer down with a thud. "She paid me to keep my mouth shut. Said if I said anything about those late-night meetings, she'd ruin me. And I believed her. Shouldn't have, but I did." "What meetings?" Caroline pressed. Jerry finally met her eyes, his expression a mix of shame and regret. "Every night for a week before the will was changed, Abigail was in that study with your dad. She'd lock the door, and when she came out, your dad looked worse and worse. One night I heard him yelling. Said something about not wanting to cut Caroline off. And then, nothing. After that, Abigail told me to keep my mouth shut and fired me." Caroline's blood ran cold. Abigail hadn't just manipulated their father, she'd terrified him into submission. And Jerry's confession was the first solid proof she had. "Jerry," Caroline said, her voice trembling, "you have to tell this to a lawyer." Jerry shook his head violently. "No way. Abigail's got connections, powerful ones. She'll destroy me." "Please," Caroline pleaded, grabbing his arm. "You owe it to my father. You owe it to me." Jerry pulled away, eyes haunted. "I'm sorry, Caroline. I can't." Caroline watched as he stumbled out of the bar, shoulders slumped. The truth was finally within reach, but it was slipping away as quickly as her time and money. If Jerry wouldn't talk, she'd have to find someone who would. Someone who could corroborate the nightmare Abigail had orchestrated. Someone who was willing to risk everything to take her down. The echo of Jerry's words haunted Caroline as she paced the length of her tiny apartment, now almost empty. The landlord had already started removing her belongings, stacking them carelessly by the curb. The eviction notice glared at her from the kitchen counter, a stark reminder that time was running out. Caroline grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts, searching for anyone who might still be willing to talk. Her eyes landed on one name, Gloria Trent. Gloria had been her father's secretary for nearly 20 years, a woman who knew everything about everyone in the Callahan family. If anyone had seen or heard something damning, it would be Gloria. Caroline called, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic gnawed at her insides, and she decided to drive to Gloria's house, her old sedan sputtering as it struggled to start. When she arrived, the small one-story home looked deserted. The windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly open. Caroline's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, calling out Gloria's name. "Gloria, are you here?" A faint rustling came from the living room. Caroline moved cautiously, her heart pounding. The room was a mess. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, picture frames shattered. And there, on the couch, sat Gloria, her eyes wide and unfocused, a fresh bruise forming on her cheek. "Gloria!" Caroline rushed to her side, kneeling down. "What happened? Who did this?" Gloria's lips trembled. I shouldn't have said anything." "Said what? To who?" Caroline pressed, her voice urgent. Gloria's eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone to burst in. "I got a call last night. A man. He said I needed to keep quiet about the will, about what I heard Abigail and your father discussing." Caroline's blood ran cold. "Did he say who he was?" Gloria shook her head. "But he knew things. Things only Abigail would know. He said if I talked, it would be worse next time." Caroline swallowed, her throat dry. "What did you hear, Gloria? You have to tell me." Gloria's eyes welled with tears. "I overheard Abigail telling your father that you were going to ruin everything, that you were planning to sell the family business and disappear with the money. She said you were unstable, that you couldn't be trusted. Your father was so confused, Caroline. He didn't know what to believe." Caroline's fists clenched. Abigail had lied. She'd convinced their father that Caroline was a threat, a danger to their legacy. And now, Abigail was willing to send men to threaten and silence those who knew too much. "Gloria," Caroline said, her voice breaking, "you have to tell this to the police." Gloria shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, I can't. They'll come after me again, or worse." Caroline's heart sank. First Jerry, now Gloria. Abigail's reach was deeper and more sinister than she'd ever imagined. And with nowhere left to go and no allies left to turn to, Caroline felt herself teetering on the edge of despair. But as she left Gloria's house, one thought burned in her mind. Abigail wasn't just protecting herself. She was hiding something much bigger. And whatever it was worth enough to her to destroy anyone who dared to uncover it. Caroline sat in her car, parked outside the rundown motel she'd be calling home for the foreseeable future. The landlord had finally forced her out, tossing her remaining belongings onto the sidewalk like they were garbage. The few possessions she managed to salvage filled the back seat. A duffel bag stuffed with clothes, a handful of family photos, and her father's notebook, now dog-eared and worn from her constant rereading. Inside the motel room, the air was stale and thick with the scent of cheap cleaning products. The bed creaked as she sat down, staring at the ceiling, trying to push back the overwhelming sense of defeat. Abigail had systematically dismantled her life, stripping away everything and everyone she'd ever relied on. And now, it was clear she wouldn't stop until Caroline was completely silenced. Caroline's phone buzzed, startling her. The number was blocked. Her heart pounded as she answered. "Hello?" A slow, mocking chuckle echoed through the line. "Abigail. Enjoying the new accommodations, sis?" Caroline's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" "Oh, just checking in. Making sure you're not planning anything. Reckless," Abigail said, her voice dripping with venom. "After all, we wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to you." "You can't intimidate me," Caroline shot back, her voice shaking. "Oh, I think I already have," Abigail said smoothly. "Just ask Gloria, or Jerry, or anyone else who thinks they can cross me." The line went dead. Caroline threw the phone across the room, watching it bounce off the wall and land on the dingy carpet. Abigail was untouchable, and if she could reach Gloria and Jerry, what was stopping her from doing worse to Caroline? Caroline ran a trembling hand through her hair. She needed a plan, and fast. The police wouldn't help. Abigail had too many connections, and Gloria and Jerry were too terrified to speak. But there was one person she hadn't considered. Someone who had been inside Abigail's life long enough to see her true nature. Wesley. Wesley Hart was Abigail's ex-husband, the only man who had ever dared to stand up to her and survive. They had divorced 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled about what really drove them apart. Caroline had always thought Wesley was cold, even cruel, but maybe he was the only one who truly knew what Abigail was capable of. Caroline grabbed her keys and headed for the door. She had no idea where Wesley was now, but she was going to find him. And if anyone knew Abigail's darkest secrets, It was the man who had once shared her bed. Caroline found Wesley Hart slouched over the counter at a dingy bar on the edge of town. The man who once ruled the real estate world now looked like a ghost, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking around a glass of bourbon. Caroline slid onto the bar stool beside him, her heart pounding. "Wesley?" He didn't look at her. "Go away." "It's Caroline, Abigail's sister." Wesley's jaw clenched, his grip tightened around the glass. "I said, go away." "I need your help," Caroline said, voice low. "Abigail took everything. She changed the will, threatened anyone who knew what she did to Dad. I know you saw something." Wesley snorted, a bitter, empty sound. "I saw plenty, but nobody believed me then. Why would they now?" "Because you're not the only one she's threatened," Caroline pressed. "Gloria was attacked. Jerry was paid off. Abigail's covering her tracks." Wesley finally met her eyes, his own dark and hollow. "You think that's all she did? Your father tried to change the will back 2 days before he died." Caroline's stomach dropped. "What?" "He went to the lawyer," Wesley said, voice hushed. "Said he was having second thoughts. But before he could, he fell down the stairs, cracked his skull, dead on impact." "You're saying Abigail—" Wesley's hand trembled as he set down the glass. "I'm saying it wasn't an accident, and Abigail made sure no one questioned it." The room spun. If Wesley was right, Abigail hadn't just stolen the inheritance. She had murdered their father to keep it. Caroline's hands trembled as she dialed the lawyer's number. The only person who could confirm Wesley's story was Philip Marks, the family attorney. If her father really tried to change the will back, there had to be a record of it. A draft, a call log, something. "Philip Marks' office," a brisk female voice answered. "This is Caroline Callahan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to speak to Mr. Marks. It's urgent." There was a pause. "Mr. Marks is currently unavailable." "Tell him it's about my father's will," Caroline insisted. "I know my father tried to change it back before he died." The line was silent then. "Hold, please." A minute later, Philip Marks came on the line, his voice tense. "Caroline?" "Philip, did my father come to you 2 days before he died? Did he try to change the will back to its original state?" Philip's silence was deafening. Then he sighed heavily. "Caroline, I can't discuss—" "Did he or didn't he?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Please, I need to know." Another heavy sigh. "Yes, he did. He called me that afternoon, said he'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to restore the original will. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning, but he never made it." Caroline's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "And you didn't think that was suspicious?" "I did," Philip admitted, his voice hushed. "But Abigail came in right after," said Leonard, had been confused, disoriented. "She claimed he was suffering from early signs of dementia and that he'd been making false accusations. I didn't know what to believe." Caroline closed her eyes, the room spinning. "She lied. I know that now," Philip said, his voice filled with regret. "I can pull the phone records, the calendar entry, but Caroline, Abigail is powerful. She has connections. If you go to the police, you'd better have more than just a phone call." Caroline hung up, her mind racing. She needed hard evidence, something that would prove Abigail's hand in their father's death. But how? Abigail had covered her tracks so meticulously. Then it hit her. The security cameras. Their father had insisted on installing security cameras in the main hall and on the staircase after a break-in years ago. If Abigail had been near those stairs the night her father died, there would be footage. Caroline grabbed her keys and headed for the estate. If Abigail found her first, she wouldn't make it out alive. But if she could get that footage, she'd finally have the proof she needed to take Abigail down for good. The estate loomed like a dark, silent fortress as Caroline crept through the shadows. The night air was bitterly cold, her breath misting in front of her as she crouched behind the hedges. Abigail's black SUV was parked in the driveway, headlights off but engine running. She was inside. Caroline's heart thundered in her chest. If Abigail caught her, it was over. But she couldn't wait any longer. The security footage from the night of her father's death was her only chance to expose the truth. She crept around the side of the house, using the key she'd stolen years ago when she still lived there. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The hallway where her father had fallen was dark, the same spot where his blood had pooled, staining the hardwood floors. Caroline swallowed back the bile rising in her throat and forced herself to move. The security room was down the hall, past the study. As she approached, she heard voices, Abigail's, sharp and angry, and another male voice, low and stern. Caroline pressed herself against the wall, straining to listen. "You said you'd handle her," the man snapped. "I am handling her," Abigail hissed. "But she's getting too close. If she finds that footage, then destroy it," he barked. "You know what's at stake." Caroline's blood ran cold. She had to move. Now. She slipped into the security room, her shaking hands pulling open the cabinet. There it was, the hard drive labeled with the date of her father's death. She grabbed it, shoved it into her bag, and turned to leave, only to find Abigail standing in the doorway. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Abigail's eyes blazed, her jaw tight. In her hand was a gun, the barrel aimed directly at Caroline's chest. "Dad tried to change the will," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "You killed him to keep it from happening." Abigail smirked, stepping closer. "It was supposed to be easy. You were always the weak one, the failure, but you just couldn't stay down." "You won't get away with this," Caroline said, backing up. "I have the footage." "You won't live long enough to show it to anyone," Abigail said, finger tightening on the trigger. Before Abigail could fire, a crash echoed from the hallway. Wesley barreled in, tackling Abigail to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor. Caroline scrambled for it, hands shaking as she grabbed it and pointed it at her sister. "Don't move," Caroline said, her voice stronger now. "It's over, Abigail." Police sirens wailed in the distance. Wesley had called them on his way over, finally ready to do the right thing. Abigail thrashed beneath Wesley's grip, screaming as the officers stormed in, cuffing her wrists and dragging her away. Hours later, as the sun rose over the estate, Caroline sat in the back of the ambulance, the hard drive clutched tightly to her chest. She was free. The truth was out, and Abigail was finally where she belonged, in handcuffs.